Welcome, Dr. Fuchs. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
One of the things that has come up lately as we've had some conversations has been about inclusion, special programs, IDEA law, and I thought it'd be a wonderful opportunity. You've recently come out with some research that indicates there are some questions around inclusion, and so I thought that this would be a nice opportunity to have some of those conversations. And so thank you so much for joining us, or in this case, joining me.
Sure.
So if you don't mind, I want to start with a little bit of a story about my experience with inclusion going back to my first year in the classroom. When I started, so I was a
As
social studies
teacher.
as a teacher, correct? Yeah. So I was a social studies teacher and I was coaching baseball at the time as well. And so my best friend in the building, he was quite a bit older than me, but he was a great mentor. He was a special programs teacher. And he and I would often get into debates about whether or not his students should be in my classroom. And this was really before the concept of inclusion fully took off. And I would always demand, I'd be like, no, you have to let him come to my class. That kid is, I would rather that kid get a little bit of this content rather than be in your space where you're trying to teach 7 different subjects and you're handing out worksheets and all of that kind of stuff. And so right away, I had this strong opinion on what we should be doing with these identified students. But of course, as I got older and matured a little bit, my perspective, I'm not sure if it has changed much. I still think we want to include everybody whenever possible. But let me turn that into a question for you now, and I'll stop telling stories. I think in a lot of ways we see inclusion as a moral imperative, and that has put a lot of pressure on making sure that inclusion occurs. But I wonder if that pressure then has caused us to confuse what inclusion should be and if we've been implementing it in the right way in schools.
Right. So I think you're very smart to think about it or to suggest that inclusion is oftentimes viewed as a moral imperative. And I think that in a couple of papers that I have recently written and am currently writing, I refer to the advocates of mostly, not entirely, but mostly children and youth with intellectual disabilities, sometimes referred to as complex disabilities, as abolitionists. Abolitionists because it's not a denigrating term. It's meant to convey that these advocates, by and large, want both to abolish special education placements and to have all children with and without disabilities in the general classroom. So, therefore, abolishing the current structure of general ed and special education. And their adversaries have been, for decades, people who strongly support the continuum of special education placements and services. And I refer to these people as conservationists because they want to conserve the special education placements, the full continuum of placements and services. That's not to say that there aren't abolitionists who kind of disagree or have a somewhat different view, and same for the conservation. But generally speaking, abolitionists and conservationists. To be very clear, I have always been a conservationist. Now, what that has meant, what that means for me, and what I think it means for most conservationists is they support abolitionist, and I'm going to refer to them as just abolitionist conservationists for the sake of conversation. Conservationists support abolitionists' desire to have the children that they care about most, children with intellectual disabilities, in general classrooms or wherever they want them, but they want them in general classrooms. What conservationists really get riled up about is the intent, is the presumption on the part of the way they see it, the presumption on the part of the abolitionists to speak not just for themselves in advocating for students with intellectual disabilities, but speaking for all advocates of all students with disabilities. The conservationists, I think, rightly point to the law, IDEA, and before that, PL 94-142, Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. These laws, currently IDEA, says something that you just said earlier, which is, look, everyone must try to accommodate all children in the general classroom. They Educators are the law expects educators to work hard to integrate these kids and do everything they can that's reasonable to accommodate these kids. So everyone agrees with the law that the presumptive placement is the general classroom. But the law is equally clear that when a student or students cannot be accommodated despite best efforts in the general classroom, then the general classroom is no longer the appropriate placement. The general classroom is no longer the quote unquote least restrictive environment. And conservationists, in my view, write that abolitionists, willfully or not, deliberately or not, have for decades defined least restrictive environment as the general classroom. Um, and so 2 points. One, you've got this asymmetry. Conservationists look to abolitionists as the rightful spokespeople for the children and youth that they primarily advocate for. Abolitionists do not return the favor. They do not say to conservationists, well, you are the authorities on children with learning disabilities, behavior disorders, speech and language impairments, and so forth and so on. They say instead, we speak for everybody. We speak for all kids because you, conservationists, don't really understand the situation, that you don't understand what your kids really need, demonstrated by your continuing support of the full continuum of special education placements and services. And so, what has upset and perplexed people like me is, how do the abolitionists basically live with themselves when insisting that all children and youth, including many, 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 about whom they know very little in terms of what they need instructionally and otherwise, what permits them to continue with this strategy of full inclusion, all kids in the general classroom full time? And this is a long way of coming back to your point, which is part of the reason, part of the explanation for abolitionists' decades long insistence on a general ed placement is it is the moral or ethical position to take.
And so I appreciate that. And I love this opportunity to evolve my thought a little bit because by my introduction, I was an abolitionist, right? And a lot of that even stems from the idea that it is more protective of kids rather than isolating them. Or because what I remember from being in school was the kids in that room, what we typically call the resource room now. And they felt like an isolated group, ostracized a bit. And so I think when I came in as a newer teacher, that was one of the things that I was trying to make sure that it did not happen to my students. But your point is a very, very good one, which is the conservationists are also going to take that stance that least restrictive is not always the classroom. So that leads to a couple of questions from me then. One, do gen ed kids also get least restrictive environment? Meaning, is there some right of a gen ed kid to go into an instructional environment where there aren't outbursts, disruptive behaviors that are not managed?
Yeah, the rights of the gen ed kids and their parents is that they get a strong, academically focused, emotionally supportive education. That's what we need to provide gen ed kids with, a good education. I mean, our future depends on it, right? I mean, they are our future. If they are poorly educated, we're in much worse shape than if they are much better educated. The citizens of Finland understand this. They pay their teachers more than they pay their doctors. And being a teacher in Finland is a big deal, not just in terms of money, but in terms of status and the general understanding that what they're doing is vitally important for nationhood. We don't have that same view here, very unfortunately. So we don't talk about, policy people in education don't talk about LRE for general ed kids. Rather, they talk about quality education. The presumption is that they're going to be in a general classroom. And so, how do we make the general classroom much more responsive to what they need as students?
what I hear or comes to me often is when there's that overlap between where we're trying to bring identified students into a gen ed classroom because we believe that to be least restrictive, does that start to diminish the opportunity for gen ed kids? I've seen it often where there's gen ed teachers and there's special programs teachers, and they don't work together. Instead, it feels like a competition.
So let me tell you that two things. The research, there has been research on the potentially negative effect of including students with disabilities in general classrooms on students without disabilities. Generally speaking, that research does not find strong evidence for what we're talking about. That does not preclude, it does not ignore the fact that there are times when, as you've described, a particular kid with a disability is so disruptive that other kids' learning is negatively affected. But generally speaking, that is not the case. The inclusion of students with disabilities, especially those who have serious learning problems, and I'm not talking about children with intellectual disabilities, kids with severe learning disabilities, severe dyslexia, so forth and so on, hearing impairments, kids with very low vision or who are blind, and so forth and so on. The more of those kids in a given classroom, and as a teacher, I'm sure you resonate to this, the more challenging you are making that environment for the teacher, regardless of whether she has another teacher alongside of her. There is an inverse relationship between the greater the diversity, the way that we're talking about diversity here, the greater the academic diversity, the less the quality of education for all. It just becomes a more and more daunting task for teachers. And throw in the fact that a lot of teachers these days, through no fault of their own, are being trained very poorly. An offshoot discussion that we could have. But the training that is given to many young people who want to be teachers is deplorable. Um, and so they're just not prepared. They're overwhelmed.
When we do end up including kids and we have a sped teacher who's co-teaching, or we have paras, what is that relationship supposed to look like to actually enhance that learning for the student who has been identified and protect the learning that's occurring for the gen ed students?
So co-teaching has a lot of different looks to it. There are lots of different ways of doing it. Bottom line is there has been a fair amount of research on co-teaching. The evidence is very discouraging for students with disabilities with serious learning problems because the the instructional the instruction that goes on as a function of co-teaching has to do with things like modifying demands, accommodating the curriculum, um, providing emotional support, stuff like that. Not not bad things to do, but it doesn't address the fact that many students with disabilities have the kind of serious learning problems that can only adequately be addressed through intensive remediation. And they don't get that in co-teaching. They just don't get it. It's not part of the package.
I guess to follow up with that, then, how do we begin to identify what becomes the least restrictive environment? Because I think when I've seen it in practice, this becomes the greatest or most difficult part of the discussion. And where we are cycling through is decisions on whether we want resource classes or we want reading intervention. Should that student who's been identified be in a reading intervention class and a grade level class, or should they be in a grade level class and a resource class? So there's all of these variations. Should they be in a co-taught class, right? So there's a near infinite number of variations as to how we can approach it. And I guess what I'm begging for now, and a lot of people are some simple ways to decide what the best place for these students is.
So, two things. First of all, there is an IEP team. It is their responsibility to track how well students with disabilities are doing in the general classroom. If the kid in question is being accommodated successfully, as demonstrated by actual work and actual behavior, then wonderful. The kid is in her least restrictive environment. But if the kid is not demonstrating adequate performance, then despite efforts to include her, then it's likely that that setting is not her least restrictive environment. So the inability of or the incapacity of general classrooms to accommodate all, which is the presumption behind the decades long policy of full inclusion, right? Because one of the basic assumptions of full inclusion, of the abolitionist position, is that general ed can be made sufficiently accommodating for all or to all students. That is just not true. It's never been true, and it's not true today. And so more and more people are finally understanding that the general classroom has limits. That should not be a huge revelation. Everything has limits, right? The best teacher in the world has her limits. You put enough students in a classroom with a really good teacher, and you will reduce that teacher to being less good than she would be otherwise. It's a fact. So this is becoming increasingly known. There have been in the last 10 plus years, 15 years, efforts to rethink general education, structurally rethink it. So we have now RTI slash MTSS, response to intervention, also known as multi tiers of what is it?
MTSS, right? System
Yes,
of
sorry.
supports.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
systematic sports. Yeah, um, and so the essence of RTI MTSS is that general ed, and in principle, this has always struck me as a good thing. Instead of thinking of what we offer kids as either general ed or special ed, with RTI MTSS, general ed for a lot of people now in a lot of places is subsumes, if you will, tiers 1, 2, and 3, or 1 and 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, depending upon where we're talking about. But the point is multiple tiers of increasingly intensive instruction. So if a child is placed in general ed, there's an effort to try to accommodate her in general. It's not working. That's tier 1. We then think about moving her not to special ed, but to a general ed tier 2, which is defined in a lot of different ways, but principally as providing the student with more intensive, more focalized, more specialized instruction. And so instead of the student being in a group of 27, she's in a group of 6 or 7 students, all of whom are performing basically at the same level, and teachers believe a somewhat different curriculum might be good for them. And those kids' progress is supposed to be tracked for a period of time. If kids respond, then they look to transition these kids back into the general classroom. If they don't respond, then there may be even a more intensive a more intensive instructional version of general education. And that's all before special education.
Right. And so if we get to that special education piece, when we talk about interventions, because this is another conversation that we're having often as to what our intervention should look like and who should be providing it. When we talk about a student with an IEP, if it's for reading, it makes a lot of sense that they would go to the reading teacher. And that reading teacher is the specialist who would work with them on their reading skills. What role does a special education teacher play? What should that intervention look like with these students?
So there's good news and not such good news with respect to this. First, the good news is that for the last 20 plus years, unbeknownst to many, there has been ongoing research conducted mostly, but not always, special educators, mostly, but not entirely in the United States. A lot of this work is moving now into Germany and other European countries. And it's called data based instruction, or D as in boy, I. Data based instruction is really individualized instruction. Individualized. And so the response to intervention MTSS typically does not include the kind of individualization of instruction that I'm about to briefly describe to you. It has to do more with small groups of so, general ed, you go from a group of 27 to a group of 8 to maybe a group of 4. That's it. And there's a curriculum, and everyone is, and hopefully it's a good curriculum, and it's administered or implemented by someone who knows the curriculum. Okay? That's going to help a good number of kids, but it's not going to help all the kids, especially kids with very serious learning problems. Kids with the very serious learning problems across disability categories need something really special and really individualized. What makes it really special? What makes it really special is essentially the instructor. The instructor starts with her best guess as to what will work. She's working with individual children. What will move this child's performance? She's working with a very, very technically strong measurement system that she uses 2 times a week at least to make sure that the kid is performing in the direction, moving in the is progressing in the direction that he needs to progress in. And what makes this person special is she knows a lot about instruction. She knows about assessment and instruction. So she tries an approach for several weeks, and she's tracking the kid's progress. The kid is making no progress. She then, on the basis of what she knows about this kid now, she starts modifying the program in small ways, maybe in big ways. Again, tracking progress. And for really tough kids with serious learning problems, this can go on for weeks with no return until hopefully the teacher finds a combination of instructional and motivational and behavioral strategies to bring to bear to move this kid more quickly. And so what I'm talking about here is teachers who feel comfortable working with kids without knowing what is going to work. What hopefully eventually works is found through an inductive process. It's smart trial and error. That is the essence of what special ed should be. Now, the bad news, if you ask me how many special educators are trained in this, very few. Why? That's another story.
All right, so let me ask you this then. What you just described, this is what we're working towards, right? We're not there yet. Education is a wicked problem. Feels like there's no answer, so we're always just trying to work on better. So what you just described, is that a standalone class? Is that a partnership with the gen ed teacher where that special teacher is working on a variety of skills and efforts and assessments so that kid can then be successful in the gen ed class? What does that relationship look like?
It may look like X in part of Wyoming. It may look like Y in another part of Wyoming. It may look like Z in New York City. But generally speaking, we're talking about if a school can do this, if a school has the resources, there's no reason why such a child, such a student, and such a teacher can't get together for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours a day working on whatever it is, reading or math or both or something else, with the child otherwise being in the mainstream. So it doesn't necessarily require a special school, although many parents are moving to special schools because out of frustration with, the homeschool.
Can I give you a real case scenario here to help me work through it? Let's say we have a student who they struggle in both reading and math, which are the common areas that our goals are written for. And they're certainly of the nature that they should be in a gen ed class, learning, getting access to grade level skills, but they definitely need some additional support. Would it make sense, because we're limited, it's a secondary school, they have, there's 7 periods in a day, so there's some limitations. Would it make sense for that kid to have an intervention period where some of the time they are working with the SPED teacher, developing some of those skills that you described, and then some of the time they're working with the reading teacher, on some below grade level skills. And then sometimes they're working with a math teacher. So they have an intervention block, but they're working on a variety of skills, including potentially executive functioning skills, behavior skills, because I'm trying to imagine how to get all of that work done in a very limited amount of time.
Yeah, I think the short answer to your question is yes. The caveat is, and I know this, and I'm sure you know it too, the more people you bring into the process, however well-meaning everyone is, the more complicated you're making it, and the more difficult it is to maintain communication between everybody. So I like to try to keep things as simple as possible. But the truth of the matter is that whether we're talking about high school or junior high school or elementary school, I mean, we when I say we, I mean the community of teachers and academics and policy people and school administrators, we are not producing experts. When I used to do a lot of teacher training, when I would go various places around the country, never to Wyoming, by the way, um, I would always ask people when I'm talking to teachers, I would always say to people, so how many of you in here can honestly say that there are instructional experts? And usually I'm talking to elementary school teachers. How many of you have instructional experts in your schools? Very few. Very few people ever raised their hands. And I wasn't meant to embarrass and, shame or anything. It's just the fact that there isn't, there tends not to be, let's put it that way, there tends not to be instructional experts.
And I think that was kind of why I asked that question, because I think what happens at the secondary level is that that special programs teacher probably does feel comfortable in general assessment, general instruction, but then the content comes around and all of a sudden it's like, wait a second. I do want to follow up with this though, and I maybe your research never gets here because this is really a boots on the ground kind of question, but I do wonder how much of the work that we are doing with these students who have been identified is enabling their disability versus preparing some level of independence. Because what we often see is we see pressure from families. Well, why do they have a C? Why do they have a D? And the answer can't be, well, that matches their skill set, because parents want to see better scores. So I wonder if you can, if any of your research or experience has you've come across what this structure has done for the confidence and ability for these students to become truly independent learners.
Well, let me put it this way. And I speak from personal experience. I speak as a researcher, having done lots of instructional work for decades. And I'm talking about kids who you may not know. Yeah, I mean, you may not know the kinds of kids that I have in my head, and that may be part of a slight misalignment between you and me. But the kids I'm talking about uh, are are generally capable kids. I mean, they don't have severe cognitive impairments. Okay, so we have expectations for these kids. We being not just teachers, parents, grandparents, everybody have expectations for these kids. But their learning problems are so severe that despite best efforts on their part, they're not making it. And so what they need teachers who know what they're doing, who really understand instruction. They can skin a cat 50 ways, and who also are have the emotional wherewithal to hold these kids' feet to the fire. Because by the time a lot of the teachers get these kids have already suffered years of failure. They don't want, you know, they don't want to meet Miss Smith one to one, in the room down the hall, because all Miss Smith is going to be doing is torturing them to try to get them to do stuff that they know they can't do. So it becomes so the expertise of the teacher is not just she knows instruction. She knows how to both be demanding and supportive at the same time, which is a trick. And that's what adds to the challenge of trying to do what's best for many students with disabilities.
What I appreciate about what you just said is I think there's two things at play because you pointed out that sometimes the kid recognizes their own limitations before the adult does. And my gosh, what a frustrating thing that might be. I do know that you have some other things scheduled. I'll share some final thoughts, give you a chance to share some final thoughts if you want, and then I'll let you go. One of the things we try to do is leave people with just one or two really powerful things to do right away. And so if I'm meeting with the adults that are working with the students that you're talking about, and they're begging for a next step, a next idea, what advice can I give them? Or what's one or two things I can say, hey, let's try doing this that might be most effective for these kids?
Well, okay, so it depends. It depends which kinds of kids we're talking about. If we go back to tiers 1, 2, and 3 in general ed and special ed, different recommendations for tier 1 than there would be for tier 2, than there would be for tier 3. I would say, and again, I'm not sure who we're talking to. Who I'm talking, am I talking to a colleague of yours who teaches 11th grade history, or am I talking to a reading teacher in an elementary school? And who are their students? What's the student population? All of that matters. But I would say that one of the things that really hampers one of the things that really gets in the way of school. I have great respect for school people. Okay. I was a third grade teacher. I was a fourth grade teacher. I was in private schools and public schools before I became an academic. And so I know how hard teaching is. And especially these days, because when I taught, there was still a modicum of, well, not that there isn't today, but I think there's even less respect today for the hard work that teachers do than maybe 20 or 30 years ago for all kinds of different reasons. So I really admire teachers who get up every day and work hard. What I think really hampers the efforts of a lot of people in schools, high school, junior high school, elementary school, is that there's a dearth of information about things like curriculum. What is a really good reading curriculum? There are lousy reading curricula, even though they're published and even though their authors are making millions of dollars. They're lousy. And we even have research that they're lousy and they're used. Why? Not because teachers want to do in their kids. They don't know any better. Somebody has an in with the district. I mean, politics plays a huge role here. It's disgusting, but it's true. And so there aren't enough honest brokers, if you will, who are smart, knowledgeable, and who are willing to do the right thing by teachers and by kids. What makes this even more tragic is that over time, thanks in part to federal dollars, which are no longer there, people developed websites specifically for teachers to go to with questions like, what is a good general education math curriculum? If there are 3 or 4 or 5 of them, how do I decide between them? So forth and so on. Tier 2, well, I'm interested in doing small group instruction in X domain. What are the curricula that have been developed? There are curricula for small group instructions. But again, no one curates it. I'm sorry. Most school folks cannot by themselves curate that. They need somebody to curate it for them. So, and it's there. It's there on the web. It's there on the web. And so I would say one thing across the board is somebody at the district level or maybe at the building level needs to say, let's get smart about this or let's get smarter about this. And there are resources. There are specific resources to go to help teachers. That just scratches the surface of your question, but
Yeah.
it does address it.
No, and honestly, usually that's where we land. Brian and I like talking about big picture stuff, and so rarely do we resolve anything. We just continue the conversation as it goes. I do want to, one more question. I said one more, but here we are, one more. When schools get this right, what does it feel like? What does it look like?
It's funny you asked that because I was just part of a conversation a week or two ago with 4 private schools. Okay. These are private special education schools. So it's not going to be exactly it's not going to fit exactly with your experience and a lot of the experiences and contexts for people who are listening. But these schools in various parts of the country, these 4 schools, smaller schools, okay, smaller than a lot of public schools, and they have resources that a lot of public schools don't have, but they have really, really thought about and refined their what they teach, how they teach it, who they hire, who they don't hire, and they track every even these are special ed kids, by the way. They're most of them are not all of them, but many of them are special ed kids. And their progress is tracked weekly, religiously. It tracked religiously. And one of the schools, the director of one of these schools said at one point, look, we live or die by how well we do and by these kids. And we contract with their parents. And sometimes the contracts have to be revised. But if we can't meet the revised contract for their child, we give half the money back. And so someone asked, well, how often do you do that? And he said, much more often than you think. So they have developed flexible curricula. They've experimented with all kinds of scheduling and collaborative relationships with teachers. Other schools come to them to look to see what they do, how they spend their day. It's not just private schools. I've been in really good public schools. I'm a public school guy. A combination of having really smart, talented, committed people in the same place at the same time.
Pulling in the same direction?
Pulling in the same direction. Absolutely
Yeah,
pulling in the same
yeah,
direction.
yeah.
And you don't always get all of that. You just don't always get it. And it's a shame. There's no excuse why we can't do that everywhere if we had enough money and commitment, and we don't.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I'm going to give you a chance if there's anything you want to share out, and then I'm going to let you go.
I would say something, this is going to be controversial, but I will tell you how I really feel. I feel like education is in crisis, and not that there aren't really good schools. There are really good schools, but there are way too few of them. In many places, it is a crisis, and the American public does not understand the nature of the crisis and the seriousness of the crisis. And there are a lot of things that contribute to it, and part of it is politics. There's one political party that is hell-bent on defunding the public schools and monetizing education, and they're putting on the altar, they are making a sacrifice of millions of kids to prove a point that we can start using public monies for private education enterprises. And I think people need to think about that.
Dr. Fuchs has been fantastic. Thank you so much. You offered so much, and I appreciate it.